Welcome, everybody. I know that's always so distracting, but you know it's being recorded. I'm Mayor Schulman with the Hartford Foundation's Nonprofit Support Program. And with me today, somewhere in a Zoom box, is Melanie Tavares, our director, as well as my NSP colleagues, Monica Kelly and Betsy Johnson. A special thank you, as always, to Betsy and Monica for helping to plan and coordinate today's session. As I always say, Zoom is definitely a team sport, and we have a great team. And speaking of great teams, today's session is a partnership between the Hartford Foundation, the Community Foundation for Greater New Haven, and the Fairfield County Community Foundation. I know that Jackie Downing from the Community Foundation for Greater New Haven is with us today, as well as Karen Brown from Fairfield County Community Foundation, and Danielle Marchione, I think may or may not be able to join us today, but is with us here in spirit. So today's session is a kind of 101 on strategic alliances for consultants, and we'll provide kind of a high-level overview of the topic, because we know that strategic alliance discussions do come up in a variety of your consultancies with nonprofits, both directly and indirectly. And because this is a 101 session, we realize that there may be follow-up to today's session that may be helpful to you in your role as consultants. So please indicate in the survey that will be sent to you immediately following the session, what else might be helpful to you. If we were to do sort of a follow-up, what would that look like? And as we go through today's session, we really encourage you to ask questions by posting them in the chat. I think that'll probably be the easiest way to manage questions, and we'll try to get to as many of your questions as we can. As you heard at the start of the session, it is being recorded, but the breakout discussions will not be recorded. So we are delighted to have Ann Urashik and Jim Berson of FIO Partners with us to lead today's session. Both Ann and Jim are kind of old friends of the foundation and have done work with our staff and board, and have also done extensive work with nonprofits across the state and across the country. So I want to thank them both very much during a very busy time for them for putting together today's session for us. And I will turn the program over to Ann and Jim.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Mayor, for that introduction. It is great to see so many of you here. As we were getting ready for today's session, I said, you know, this is a little bit like a family reunion. It's so nice to see all of you. It's been a long time as capacity builders and consultants that we've been able to be together. And it's just really nice to be with you this afternoon. So I'm going to do some share slides and sort of get started into today's session. And let me just go ahead and do that. Slide. This is where the technical fun that we've all gotten used to in the last year and a half is awesome. Great. So for those of you who haven't met or interacted with FIO Partners, we are a consulting firm that is based here in Connecticut, but we have a fantastic team that's actually based here in Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and Pennsylvania lately. So I'm excited to be with you. And really our work is around supporting leadership decision-making. For those of you who haven't met us, you know, FIO is actually Latin for become, because we work with our clients to really become the organizations they envision, to make the impact that they envision come to fruition. And so it's just a real pleasure to be with you today. But one of the things Jim and I chatted a little bit about before today's session was, you might be asking, why FIO Partners? We had a chance to take a look at the attendance list for today's session, and many of you on the call this afternoon have facilitated strategic alliances, have supported nonprofits in building collaboratives and partnerships, and in so many ways can add tremendous value to this afternoon's conversation. And so we're hoping today is really interactive, and that each of you that have chosen to come today can really share your own experiences with strategic alliances, as well as we will share ours as well. But part of this journey for our firm really started with Jane Arsenault, who's my partner at FIO Partners, who wrote a book in 1999 called Forging Nonprofit Alliances, which was one of the first books to really address in some ways the consolidation of the sector and really lay out a roadmap for how nonprofits can really think about advancing their mission in a period of really what was contraction for the nonprofit sector. And when you look at the history of the sector, the book was written really at the first moment of that contraction. But since then, and really since the creation of FIO Partners, and even just in the last 6 years, we've supported 44 engagements around this work, whether that's bringing mergers to fruition from partner search, feasibility, and implementation, support to community collaboratives in terms of planning, governance, and research supports, as well as other types of partnership explorations and supports. And so it's just a real pleasure to be with you this afternoon to explore this topic and really lay a foundation for each of you to think about in your own work, how is this showing up? And how can you really think about integrating some of this knowledge into your own practices? But before I go any farther, I just want to make a little bit of space for Jim to jump in and also introduce himself and kind of get us started again for today's session.
Sure. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jim Berson. I am one of those Rhode Island people that works with FIO Partners. I'm also a recovering former nonprofit executive director and CEO, both on an interim and permanent basis. So I have been on both sides of these conversations. So everything from the asset purchase agreement that I'm getting emails about that is closing today between Mosaic and Vantage Group in the state of Connecticut as they're looking at wire transfers, so the dollars literally sort of happening as we speak, to work that I've done and when I worked in the nonprofit space myself to bring on new organizations, spin organizations off, create partnerships, etc. So thrilled to be here with all of you today from out of state. So it's a little different kind of reunion for me than it is for Anne, but it's great to see all of your faces and looking forward to being able to do this again at some point in person. But we are really, really curious to know why you are here. So my guess is it's not the free food, but it could be the free parking. But we do have a quick poll to run past you just to understand sort of what brought you here today and to make sure that we're able to tailor our comments and conversation to really meet your best needs. So you see the poll in front of you, and if you can click on the option, I guess that makes the most sense for you or fits best for you, and we can watch the returns come in. So I'm told this is not ranked choice voting, and we're not in New York City, so we hope to get the numbers correct the first time. But please sort of answer as you go, and we'll see how these results turn out. All right, you guys are quick on the trigger finger there. It's great, 28 out of 32, and so it looks like. Again, not surprisingly, and again, we saw this, and even in the survey work that we did last summer and fall in both Connecticut and Rhode Island, we certainly saw more organizations, again, 47% of you or 14 of you are seeing more of these opportunities in front of your clients and you're looking to be more helpful. We knew from the registration list that we are talking to some members of the choir in terms of folks have done this work before. 6 of you, it's a core part of your work. So we hope to not only share what we know, but also hear from you as well. Several of you, 4 of you have done this in the past on a limited basis. And a couple of you are brand new or are curious as to sort of what this might mean. So all of you, or most of all of you have some experience or some exposure to this, and a couple of you where it's great that you're excited and interested in this topic. So I'm gonna stop at the share and we will keep moving on here.
Great. And so really, what's our approach for today's session? So this is really about creating a space for our consulting and advisory colleagues. I think it's important to recognize in the sort of space we have today, we not only have consultants and advisors, we also do have some foundation staff joining us today. Oftentimes foundation staff really are interacting with grantees and really sought after in terms of providing strategic advisory support. And so this is really all about creating a space for us together to really explore how do we advance these conversations? How do we identify sort of moments in the context where it may make sense to kind of prompt or encourage this type of consideration? We'll dive into kind of in some ways at a high level, the types of alliances that do exist and their real potential to amplify impact and promote sustainability. And again, this is going to be pretty interactive as we go through it today. And one of the things that we wanted to do before we actually get too far into today, because we promise we will not talk at you for 3 straight hours, is we do want to give you a chance to get to know each other. And so what I'm going to do is a quick stop share. And I'm going to lean into Monica. Hey, Monica, can you have us do a quick breakout around kind of bringing people together just for a few minutes to introduce themselves? So we're going to really start to talk about, when we use this term, what is a strategic alliance? What are we actually talking about? And I'm going to hand it over to Jim in 1 second. But one of the things we want to sort of make sure that as we're exploring this topic, that we sort of how we frame today's session. This is all about, as consultants and advisors, really thinking about what are the conditions that warrant a conversation about a strategic alliance. We want to have a conversation with you really about function. How do we start a conversation that doesn't like run down the road of oftentimes like we'll get a call that says, we have a partner, we think we should merge. And, my first answer question is like, why? Why do you think you should merge? What is the purpose of this coming together? Yes, a merger in the end may be the right answer, but we've really got to help clients really think about their own internal clarity and their why. So what are we hoping to accomplish by this partnership? And then lean in on the back end of the day to really talk about the form. And so we will often, you'll hear us say it a few times this afternoon, is to say, the structure of the combination is a means to an end. And we need to build clarity for our clients and our grantees around the why are we doing this, to really help us understand which structure helps us best accomplish that. And so that's our kind of frame for today's session. And so I'm going to lean into Jim though to really start to talk about what are we actually talking about when we talk about strategic alliances.
Right, and so strategic alliances are not one thing, they really are a range. And later this afternoon, we'll give you a sense of the different options and models that exist. And in many ways, when you've seen one strategic alliance, you've seen one strategic alliance, right? And so we find that they come in all sort of shapes and flavors and colors, but they also really sort of work along a continuum. And that continuum is sort of, or a couple of continuum, I guess. And so we see on the far left, the notion of coordination, right? So as I think my days running a YMCA, network of YMCAs in Providence, I think about all the different folks that I had to sort of collaborate with or coordinate our efforts with. So where we sort of stepping on each other's toes in certain communities or with certain activities. And so the coordination activities are really about exchanging information, avoiding duplication, orchestrating our efforts, cross-referral, and supporting advocacy efforts, right? So that's oftentimes those are verbal agreements. They don't require a whole lot of commitment. They really sort of literally are about playing nicely and sort of traffic cop sort of work in the sandbox to make sure we're not stepping on each other's toes and really just sort of making sure that we're not bombarding the same clients or same folks with services on the same day, that we're really sort of working together in a way that makes it easier for folks. But it's pretty informal, pretty light. And again, it's really just about making sure that we're all coordinated and exchanging information. As you move to the right, you move towards more collaboration. What we find in collaboration are that this is where the work gets a little bit more complex, where the number and kinds of organizations involved that might become larger. Right? This is oftentimes in this collaboration area where you see community impact models, right? Community coalitions oftentimes fit in this group here. The magnitude of the purpose rises in significance, and the number of levels that need to be increased, that need to be coordinated, need to increase. And I think about my work when I ran, again, a network of Ys, and we were working with several partners in a school around after-school programming. And one organization had a case management, another organization dealt with mental health. The Y dealt with after-school, a literacy organization worked with parents. And we were all sort of mutually accountable. So we had, some degree of written agreement, but it was by no means sort of legally binding. They weren't formal contracts, more sort of MOUs, memorandums of understanding. But we had to be coordinated not only at the top, but also sort of at the line level where the work happened. And also the managers of those different organizations need to be talking to each other on a regular basis to make sure that the work was all intersecting. It was more than just coordinating, but that the work we did with kids in the afternoon was connected to the work that folks are doing with their parents in the evenings. And then as you move to the far right, you end up with consolidation. These are where legal changes will occur in organizations. Again, I mentioned I have a closing today of an asset acquisition. Another closing this week, I think, of a strategic alliance that is more of a subsidiary parent organization model. and another organization that is literally dissolving today and transferring all of its assets to another entity. So all these three are different kinds of ways of working together. But these are really about significant increases in complexity, higher risk, both in terms of financial and legal, longer duration, right? These are legally binding agreements, hard to get out of. So, the dating metaphor often works here. So coordination is sort of, dating, right? Collaboration is going steady, and consolidation is some sort of formal arrangement between two parties. So you can kind of see that as we move more formally to the right, we move from verbal to sort of legal agreements and mergers. And also there's a notion of we give up some of our autonomy as we move to the right, and we sort of sacrifice that autonomy to more of a central authority. So in the middle, it's really about that backbone agency oftentimes, and we're also collaborating on collective impact work, all the way to the right side where we may see ourselves become part of another organization. Our bylaws are changed. Our articles of incorporation are altered or amended. So that's really what we're looking at. And if you move to the next slide, you can see again the perspective of sort of autonomy, cost, risk, control, and central authority. So at the lowest levels of coordination, collaboration, these are really informal. And as you sort of move up the chain here, you end up with increasingly sort of more complex, higher risk, higher cost kinds of arrangements that require a lot more work together at multiple levels. And as an organization, you see reduced autonomy. You are giving up autonomy for the benefit of being able to work more tightly in a more coordinated way with others. But you definitely sort of let go of autonomy as you move up the line. And certainly as you move down the line, the stakes are lower. The legal arrangements are certainly less formal, if at all, and you retain a lot more of your autonomy to get the work done. So when we think about strategic alliances, you can really end up anywhere along this continuum or along this pyramid based, again, on your why. And I think that's where we're going to move to next. Anne?
Yeah, thanks, Jim. And again, I mean, I think so. The one thing I also just sort of want to add here that is just an important context for our discussion, which is about, I think there is a trend in the sector, and there has been, that funders want nonprofits to consolidate. And there's some great banter in the sector that says, in what other sector of the economy do we tell people to collapse their businesses? Where do we do that, and why? And so what I think is important to think about as we have this conversation is, yes, these are all structures and means of accomplishing something. Each of these structures that Jim has talked about have some benefits. They also have risks. They have things in some ways that, are more complicated to deal with. And so one of the things I think we just want to acknowledge in this conversation is that I believe that these structures, if they're used in ways to advance mission, in some ways can be used to support, ensure the continuity of our most important community-based nonprofit organizations. So I think what I want us to just really think about is how can our understanding as consultants and advisors of these structures really serve that purpose. This is not a push to consolidate the sector. Often legal consolidation is not the right answer to the strategic issues facing your clients. And we're going to kind of lead into that a little bit as well as we go through this, is when would you not do this? But I think it's also important to know that, we're sharing with you in so many ways not to advance a philosophy that the sector needs to be smaller. We all hear, there are just too many nonprofits. Well, maybe, but really maybe not. And so what we have to kind of acknowledge is that as you use and think about how these structures are used, it's got to be tied to the work, and it's got to be tied to impact. So I'm looking forward to kind of continuing and advancing this conversation with you this afternoon. I think there is a lot of pressure in the sector to consolidate. But I think in some ways this is a little bit of a magic potion or a kind of a tool in your toolbox that says, yeah, no, consolidate might not be the right answer. In some cases it might be, but in some cases it really may not be. So we'll make sure that we get there today. Francesca, thanks so much for your question about the financial investment. We're going to talk a little bit more about that. And I actually have a resource that we could share after the session that sort of lays out what are the costs associated with some of these structures and some of these choices. depending on which ones they are, you may need a combination of professional advisory support, legal support, and/or accounting or financial support, depending on which of the models.
Right. And to Connie's question earlier that Mary answered, yes, these are corporate terms oftentimes because the lawyers get involved. So when we talk about legal alterations of agreements, of bylaws, of articles of incorporation, you end up with ultimately legal structures. And so again, as you move up the chain here, particularly on the prior slide where you sort of look to mergers, you're looking at more legal involvement. And I know that Priya has joined us as well and as a great resource around the pro bono attorneys, but this is where the attorneys oftentimes get involved to sort of to codify arrangements that are more than fleeting and more than just sort of transitional in terms of getting certain aspects of work done. This is about permanent change to organizations as you get more and more formal.
And I think the other thing I'll just add to Connie's question, what this spectrum takes into account is when you think about strategic alliances in the sector, I would say, I'm not sure, Jim, what our percentages would be on this particular chart, but the most nonprofits have collaborative relationships with other nonprofits. They cooperate, they collaborate, they share space, they refer to one another, and it happens all the time. And so it's important to recognize that, the types of strategic alliances that we believe in some ways that as consultants and advisors, kind of more knowledge for you is important, is really when there's more risk, when there's more money on the table, when there's more risk to the entity, when there's more players involved. We have to really ask ourselves, where do we need to sort of codify agreements to ensure that a sort of a shared project or a shared effort can really come to fruition? A lot of the work in the sector is done in a collaborative way without written agreements. And that's okay too. And so I think it's important to recognize that these kind of spectrums can include all of those sort of flavors as Jim talked about. So what we want to shift to now is a bit of the sort of shift around sort of what are some of the conditions by which that we think as consultants or advisors, we would be sort of saying, hey, have you thought about a partner or a potential partnership? And so we've got really 4 conditions that we want to kind of walk you through this afternoon. The first is really all around financial position of the entity. Are there any red flags as it relates to the viability of the entity and any other kind of issues of kind of weakness and strength from a financial perspective? What's the market position of the entity? So when we talk about market position, we're really talking about the viability of the programs that the organization runs. Are they able to continue to grow? Are they well funded? Are they well delivered? Is there viability for future funding for this particular program or program mix? Other conditions can be things really in the environment. What's happening around the nonprofit in terms of its competitors, collaborators, and purchasers. And lastly, a condition that's really around leader transition. So much of some of the requests we're getting recently have to do with sort of one leader sort of stepping out or sort of being ready to bring their role to fruition, having some concerns potentially about viability, and really sort of seeking a partner to protect the programmatic work of the entity. But let's take a little bit of a deep dive into each one of these and kind of explore each one. So the first one is really around the financial position of the entity. So this is a polar bear on an iceberg floating away. And so the key message here is don't wait too long to decide. Over the last year, certainly, we have heard about nonprofits that may not have been able to survive the pandemic or had to really go into kind of a hiatus or sort of almost a total shutdown state and try and make it through this period of time. We've also gotten calls from nonprofits that really just said, we aren't going to make it. We don't have time to find a partner. We don't have time to kind of create another roadmap. We're out of cash and we can't run our programs and we can't get funding to really continue to sustain us. And so one of the biggest things and one of the reasons that I think FIO feels really comfortable teaching this course today is because we know that you engage with nonprofits upstream of these decisions. You might be working with them on planning. You might get a call to help them with board development. You tend to be in the rooms when the CEO or the executive director calls you and says, I'm not really sure I can make payroll this month. I'm really struggling with cash flow. These are moments where as advisors, you can begin to open a door. You can begin to sort of say, really let's take a look at how you're doing and let's have a conversation about sustainability. This is when, kind of when I think about the why, like why is FIO kind of here today, it's so that more of you feel more comfortable having these upstream conversations instead of just saying, wow, we really need to do another fundraising campaign. You really actually look at this and say, you know what, I think we need to have a different conversation. So let's really go through a process to take stock of how you're doing and really try to understand, kind of where you've been and what that tells us about the potential future of the entity. And so one of the things that we're going to share with you is we have 3 handouts for today's session. One of them is a financial viability assessment. The other is a program viability assessment. And then we're going to share with you a sample partnership rationale, which is really a kind of a why for 2 partners in terms of why they're pursuing a partnership. So I'm going to just drop into the chat and I may ask for some assistance on this. So we're just going to give you a link to a Dropbox folder where all 3 PDFs are located. I'm going to drop that into the chat and hopefully y'all can access that. Everybody see that link in the chat? And so why we created this early warning tool. Does anybody remember sort of quizzes in magazines that are like, are you a good friend? Like 1 to 5, you need to work on your friendship skills. 2 to 5, you're an okay friend, and 5 to 10, you're a great friend. Okay, so we actually really thought that in fact, we needed a quick tool to help nonprofits sort of see how many potential financial red flags did they actually have. Oftentimes financial information in nonprofits, particularly between CEOs and boards, isn't always shared. And when it's shared, it's moment in time perspectives. So it's this month against last month, this month against last year's budget. It's very narrow in the way that we look at financials in a typical nonprofit board. What the early warning tool tries to do is say, let's look at some of the trends in your financials over the last 3 years and kind of note, is this a concerning trend? And so what you're trying to do is sort of fly that plane up from like the 5,000 foot level to the 25,000 foot level to say, I know we're okay this month, but when we looked at the last 3 years, these are the kinds of things we're seeing, and these are the kinds of things that are a concern. And so what the early warning tool does is it looks at a set of financial indicators and really says, if you have more than 3 of these red flags, it's time to have a conversation. It's time to start a conversation around, is organizational restructuring or seeking a partner something that we should consider? So that's the financial tool, and that's in the toolbox, and you can take a look at that. I'm wondering, hey, Jim, should we share that? Should I do a screen share and look at that tool actually?
Sure. And while you do that, I'll just mention that, again, I've worked on this side of this house for a number of years and with organizations that have been struggling as a CEO. And, the challenge is that your financial audits from your auditor don't really get you there. They are, remember the audit, other than a going concern question, which is sort of a global sort of concept, is really about, is your documentation in place, right? Have you, can you verify that every bill that you paid is actually sort of associated with an invoice? I mean, it's really about your accounting processes, not about your financial health. And so we really built this tool based on the fact that, and sorry for the auditors in the room, but that the role of the auditor is really not about giving you business advice as to whether your organization is in financial trouble. It's really about making sure that your business practices are compliant. And we see lots of business organizations with compliant business practices that have been in trouble. And so this is an opportunity to really sort of raise some flags, and as Ann said, really to drive conversation, not necessarily action, but conversation, which is the first step in the process. So Ann?
Yeah, and so I won't do a huge deep dive here, but you're really going to be looking at sort of 6 areas of consideration: deficit patterns, changes in net assets over time. The financial runway, which we call the defensive interval, is really around liquid cash assets on hand. And really, how many months could you continue based on sort of, if you got no more dollars ever to come in the door, how long could you continue operations? Liquidity, overhead as well as revenue mix. And when you're looking at revenue mix, you're really looking at a pattern of decline across multiple revenue streams. And is there any specific projected major decline in a revenue stream that might account for more than 30% of total revenue? And so again, what you're trying to do is really try to say, it's a stop and think occasion. I love that sort of phrase. It's really about sort of saying, do we have, how many of these warning signs do we have? And does that warrant kind of some dialogue at the board level, some dialogue amongst the CEO with the consultant to say, sort of, where are we financially? After that financial discussion, you're also really interested in better understanding market position. And I'm going to kind of pull that up, but even before I go there, I want to pull up the program viability assessment and take a look at that as well. So if you've kind of done this kind of deep dive on the financial side, the flip side of that is what's happening with our programs. And so the other thing that we're always really curious and understanding is, what is the status of the current programmatic work of an entity? And this is a little bit of a longer tool. I'll do a quick sort of share screen here. It talks a little bit about, kind of the combination of the early warning tool with kind of a program assessment. And I'm going to sort of skip past the introduction. But it's really about taking a look at, what's the status, and you can do this for a small nonprofit that might have one program. You could actually run this analysis for each program in an entity. You can also look at it from the standpoint of kind of all programs, just kind of on an overall basis. So you're really looking at program demand, kind of what is the demand for what we've been doing? Are we able to support this work? Are we able to deliver this program from a delivery perspective? Do we have quality and accountability in our programmatic work? And consumer loyalty and choice, which may not be relevant for all programs and services, but it's also just something to consider. And so what this also allows us to do is kind of have a conversation about the status of our programs. We'll also take a look in this tool at the cost of competition. And this is all about sort of what would it take to kind of compete more deeply in the markets where we operate. And that's coverage, and that's really about kind of consumer choice. How could we compete, and are we able to compete in terms of the investment required? And lastly, it's really about kind of understanding where you land. And so what we're trying to help people do, both with the early warning tool and with this program viability assessment, is take stock a bit of kind of where we are. And when we look at this and you combine these two tools, what you're really sort of saying is, where are we financially? What's our current programmatic mix? And what does that tell us about our future viability? It is about sort of thinking through, in so many ways, what's the conversation that we need to have? And some of that programmatic conversation is also about the context for the program in terms of, as well as kind of future trends. Jim?
And I was going to say, I'm recalling a conversation with a client that ultimately ended up moving to a strategic alliance, and the initial driver was really about the fact that they felt that in order to continue to do their work, they needed to significantly invest in their staff, quality, training, all of that goes with it. And they felt that the cost of doing so was going to be, their capacity to do it themselves was out of their reach. The cost of doing so, they were scared off by, and they said, if we could find a partner that would strengthen our training piece. And that's what started the conversation, was really around how do we drive program quality, right? So really what we're most focused on is when you see changes in market demand, or I'll use different terminology, when you see fewer people coming and fewer people wanting to pay for your client services, one of the questions we grapple with is, are those programs and services still relevant? Are they still meeting the needs of the community? And sometimes we've launched services as organizations, I'll put my CEO hat on, and we find that over time, they're not meeting the needs, and they're not as relevant, and they're not as popular. And the cost to shift or pivot those services is somewhat expensive. And you're talking about retraining of people, or potentially different people, different marketing, all that goes with it, different technology tools, locations. And so, you believe you have your mission is to deliver that impact, but you're really struggling to figure out how do you resource that impact as the world has changed and the needs have changed and the client requirements and demands have changed. And so oftentimes that can drive the conversation. So really understanding, so a lot of that piece around demand is really around program relevance.
And I think that's the other thing that Jim is leaning into, which is that, you know, all organizations are operating in this external context. And we think in a lot of ways, this is also not a conversation that frequently happens at the board level in particular. And so we have to be really pushing ourselves to say, how is the external environment around our organization, you know, changing? What's happening? What are the trends that we're seeing? How are those trends impacting us? How are we expecting the environment to continue to change? You know, one of the tools that we've used a lot in the last year and a half with clients, particularly at the beginning of the pandemic, and I'm sure many of you as well, is scenario planning. What happens if? What happens when? So what actually impacts our business, and how can we really envision possible futures, and how our organization would be impacted by those futures. And when we can sort of have those conversations collectively at the board level, you know, if you're kind of doing this kind of taking stock exercise, we've really got to be real about what's coming in the environment and what we're facing. And so the real question becomes is, as that environment changes, not only how does it impact us, but how do the expectations change for our organizations? And Karen's jumping in a lot to say this is really a role that consultants can play. And I would echo that, you know, this idea of the facilitation of conversations where we're asking boards really good questions about the environment, good questions about the status of our programs, good questions about financials. You don't always have to have the answer as the consultant, but to create the space to ask questions to kind of advance this conversation is definitely a role that you can play. The last condition that we really are seeing, especially lately, is around leadership succession. And Karen jumped in also into the chat to say, you know, that people are really thinking about merger only when there's a shift in executive director position. We hope that's not the only condition, because I think what we're going to try to get into is that in some cases it is a natural pivot point, particularly for founder-led organizations. So I think when founders are choosing to depart, they have sort of they've done what they can do. So they've either created the entity or they've been a longstanding CEO, they're ready to step out. In many cases, it's very difficult for organizations, particularly boards, to think someone else could run the entity. And so one of the things that we are seeing is an increase in the request, which is a combination of, in some ways, I call it sort of strategic alliance and search ? Service, which is, you know, you have an entity that has a leadership transition, is unclear as to whether or not they should do a search or if they should seek a partner. And so we actually think that this is an offering that will be very helpful to kind of nonprofits that are really unclear if their organization can continue, should they do a search, or should they actually use this pivot point in leadership transition as an opportunity to find a partner. And so this is really another moment or condition in a context where we do think that the conversation around strategic alliance should be considered. And so what we want to do, though, is, again, we've got incredible voices and experiences in the room with us today, is we want to break you into small groups to really do a group reflection, which is that you've all been around. I'm really curious to hear from you around the types of conditions that you've seen in your own work that have motivated at least some of the beginnings of these discussions. I think we probably all have the stories where these discussions don't go anywhere or that they don't work out. We'll get to that, but we're at the beginning of this journey. And so I'm curious to hear from each of you, and we'll break into small groups and then do a report out. We'll be able to hear from a few groups, hopefully, when we come back. But really, we'd love for you to explore this question. What are the kinds of conditions that you see that motivate these types of discussions about possible alliances? So, and if it's helpful to take a quick picture of this slide with your phone and take it with you, I'll also put the question in the chat.
Anne, is 12 minutes still good total?
Yeah, I think so. Let's give people a real chance to talk with each other.
Okay.
And we hope you had a great discussion in your breakout group with your colleagues. And before we keep going, I would love to hear from a few breakout groups. We may not be able to hear from everyone, but we really would like to hear from a few. And Mayor also just dropped into the chat. We are going to take a break at right around 2:25, and then we'll come back at 2:30 and pick it up again. We'll give everybody a little stretch since this is a 3-hour session. But is there a group that would sort of like to share some of the takeaways from their discussion with the broader group? Go ahead, JD.
Yeah, I won't presume to speak for everybody in the group, but one thing we landed on in common was that there are a lot of laudable reasons to try to have a collaboration or up to the point of a merger. And we all had a vast range of array of experience when it came to the different reasons and the different outcomes. But when it really boils down to it, finance really is going to drive it. It'll be the thing, that the recognition of the financial situation that might help people overcome their reticence of giving up the autonomy of joining. And it'll be the thing that if they don't figure it out and there is financial concerns, in the end, one way or the other, everything will go away if they don't find a way to do this.
Awesome. Thanks for that. Is there another group that would like to jump in as well?
I'll jump in I'll offer Steve a counterpoint. We talked a little bit in our group, and I might have started the conversation a little bit about the real condition that we've seen in Fairfield County for some of the mergers that the Community Foundation has funded and facilitated has been in recent years executive director transition, not financial issues. For the small organization that may be, losing their executive director planfully or unexpectedly, but then thinking about a merger into a larger organization, it's been ED transition that has been much more the driver than, poor financial position or foreshadowed poor financial position.
Yep. Awesome. Thanks. Deborah, you want to jump in?
Yes, I just wanted to follow up on what Karen just said. I agree that the leadership transition is key, and it might not just be leadership transition. It may have been an unsuccessful leader, that you have an unintentional interim come in to, and the board doesn't feel that they have it to onboard another leader in a short period of time.
Thank you for that, Deborah. Priya.
I have a counterpoint to the leader transition thing. It's sort of the flip side of the coin. I saw and participated in a very successful merger, which happened because there were two very good dynamic leaders at two organizations that had collaborated and worked together for a number of years and decided that they would be stronger as a single organization. And they were co-executive directors, and it really worked. And it was really pretty amazing. So it's sort of the opposite of somebody's leaving and we have to merge to fill the spot. It was that we had two strong leaders and they wanted to work together more closely. And they had been dating, as Jim says on the spectrum, they've been dating for a few years and they got married, and it worked out very well. Also, one thing I want to mention, Cindy Kissam, who's in our group, mentioned something. We didn't have a chance to follow up on it, but I thought I'd mention it because I thought it was interesting and important about an organization that had come to the Community Foundation, sort of sharing with the foundation what they were going through and that they were thinking about merging and seeking some help. And I think the importance of financial support for these kind of exploratory situations, not pressure from a community foundation, but support for that sort of stuff, I think can't be underestimated.
Absolutely. And again, Priya, thank you for that story about sort of shared leadership. I mean, I think we are seeing some more increasing use of co-director models in the sector, not wholly frequent, but fantastic when you can see it and it works really, really well. Any other sort of groups that want to jump in with some key takeaways or themes from their discussions? And if you don't want to share, but want to actually just share some thoughts in the chat, you can do that too.
This is Tom Colligan. We, in our discussion, found that if your board is not behind it, so there are two types of mergers. One is where the staff is driving it, and the other is where the board is driving it. And if you don't, in most cases, if you don't have the board driving it, I'm talking about smaller nonprofits. If you don't have the board driving it, you're apt to go, off the side of the road, and that's when emotion comes in. In hospitals and universities, those mergers are always driven by staff. But I think for the kinds of organizations we work in, the level of commitment and participation by the board in making it happen is essential.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for that, Thomas. I really would wholly agree with you with enthusiasm. Oftentimes we will see the two CEOs get very far ahead of boards. Oftentimes CEOs really do come together and create a story and really hatch the marriage made in heaven, and then they sort of like release it on their boards unwittingly, realizing that their boards, this is not something they want to do in so many ways because they haven't maybe been brought along in the journey.
And I think brought along, before you jump on, Ann, the brought along part is actually really important here. So when you think about board meeting agendas, we have our financial update, we have our program update, we have our executive director's update, we have these updates, right? Rarely do you see a partnership update, right? So not only are boards not brought along in terms of, wait a second, you're getting married, they're not even aware that you're dating and hanging out together, or you're even friends.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, one piece of guidance to sort of offer folks that work with boards is to really encourage those executive directors to share, and the boards to inquire about the nature of the partnerships and relationships on the left end of the continuum, right? The collaboration coordination piece. Because we'll talk a little bit later about relationships. I mean, the likely partners in more formal relations are folks that organizations have worked with already. So given how little time boards actually spend with organizations, 18, 20, 30 hours a year, and how much they need to sort of be kept up to speed and how much they forget along the way, it's really a neat opportunity, an important opportunity as you go down this path to think about how to keep boards apprised of the nature of the relationships that already exist just to get the work done on a daily basis. Sorry.
Yeah. No, it's fine. I just want to also just acknowledge there's a few comments in the chat really around both sort of just introducing this as a concept and sort of the fears that founders may have of this, but really any executive leader. The problem that we have in the sector is that the strategic alliance conversation is viewed as failure. It's viewed as giving up, and it's viewed as the end, or we're done, or we're finished. And we've got to sort of shift that mindset and shift that that perspective. In addition to that, Veronica sort of drives home a point around sort of how, in many cases, support for a nonprofit is linked to the relationships that the executive director holds, and how do we build a bench to cultivate those relationships, which is great. And Karen really adds that a local nonprofit actually has a board committee called Strategic Partnerships and meets regularly with other board members. That is a fantastic idea. And so again, we're going to talk, I think, kind of shifting into this next conversation, which is about, how do we build that internal support? How do we build our own internal clarity of a particular entity as to what their why is? This is that journey that Jim's talking about in terms of bringing along. So I'm going to go back to sort of sharing some slides, and then we'll give you guys a break just in a few minutes. All right, Jim, let's see if we can't fix this up.
Great. Go to that old from current slide there and pivot to, so Ann started the very beginning of this talking about why, right? And we can't understand the why, and if that why isn't clear as to why we should find a strategic partner, things generally don't go well. And so I think part of our role of consultants is really helping to sort of crystallize and nail down what is that rationale, what is that mission or business or whatever the case is to be made. What is the rationale for why you want to proceed with a strategic alliance? So if you go to the next slide, it's funny. It'll be funny when we get to the next slide. There we go. It's funny that, oftentimes the conversation starts at the relationship end of it, right? Well, we have this partner, we seem to get along, they have this, we have that, we should work together. And actually, we really want to encourage you as consultants to sort of help back up the truck. And really not start with the relationships, but start with, and again, part of this financial position and program assessment, we sort of started talking about from a risk perspective. Well, in a couple of slides, we'll talk about how you can sort of look at this from a strength perspective as well. So as Priya and others said, this doesn't have to be, or as Ann said, this doesn't have to be, alliances don't have to be viewed as failures. They can be viewed as celebrations and successes about increasing impact for those that you're committed to serve. And so, and the old proverb that you can go faster by yourself, but further together. And so as you think about the work that you do with your clients and the impact they hope to achieve, oftentimes these strategic alliances are really success stories, and it can be successful experiences for those organizations to really drive impact. So we started earlier today with sort of the definition of the final financial position. Where might you be at risk, or where do you have great strength? And we often think about, particularly during the pandemic, where there's stronger organizations that might be able to leverage their resources to help protect and support some of the smaller, more fragile organizations to at least sustain the work that was going on during the pandemic. Program assessment, we talked about not only sort of market risk, but market opportunity is another way of looking at it. And as Ann shared, the scenario planning, right? But these three ingredients really should help us get to our internal clarity, our why. And once we get to that why, that we can start to think about the who. But oftentimes, as I said, folks want to jump to the who, and we end up with a solution in search of a problem or in search of a question. And what we really want to do is sort of drive you to sort of think about working with the organizations. Sort of what is the case to be made for a strategic alliance? What's the next slide? Go to the next slide.
One second.
And so, Ann sort of posed this question in different words, but I'll pose it a little differently, which is, given the specific environment in which we operate and the challenges, and I would say opportunities we face, can we more efficiently and effectively deliver on our mission statement by working together with one or more partners, organizations, or by working alone? Right? And that is really the question that we encourage you as consultants to really sort of bring organizations to when you have those openings, when you've built that trust, when those sort of moments appear for organizations during a strategic planning process, during a financial review process, during a program assessment process, during a leadership transition process. Those sort of natural transition points or natural opportunities that emerge during this to raise these questions. And sometimes these sort of odd situations, such as you're called in because there's a crisis, or, I know Steve has done some interim work, maybe you're called in to do some interim work, et cetera. And these are sort of important times to really sort of ask these questions as well. So again, given the environment in which we operate and the challenges and opportunities that are before us, can we more and how might we more effectively and efficiently deliver on our mission statement by working together with one or more partner organizations, or should we continue to work alone? And so here's some of the reasons why, right? So we talked earlier about sort of, again, from a deficit perspective in terms of the financials are cratering, our programs are cratering, our board is bailed out, right? Our director is leaving. We brought in a new executive director and it's not working out. We're sort of fatigued. So those are all of the get rid of it. I want to be done with it, move it on, find a better home. Sort of, we need to have our programs adopted. That can really work out well, but we really sort of look at alliances as sort of 1 + 1 equaling 3 here. And so more than a safe haven, but really about driving impacts. So would a strategic alliance help an organization to add competencies or services to strengthen the work that they do? Is there an opportunity to strengthen infrastructure? I've got an organization right now that said, boy, we're looking at the burdens of accreditation. We're looking at we're going to have to go down the road at some point. We know that we're going to have to get stronger in the data and the quality assurance. I think that, we don't have that infrastructure, but if we could partner with someone who did, we know that we could demonstrate the effectiveness of our services. Another organization, again, in that upper left box, was talking about, boy, we work with kids with significant needs. We provide one set of services, but there's a whole array of mental health services that we can't provide, we can't access. We're not really good at it. It's not a competency we can build, but can we work with someone else to provide complementary services so we can provide better care and support to the kids in our trust? Certainly, there's around protection of programs when, as I said, as we talked before about the risk assessment, if a survival of a program is at risk, building new entities and approaches. I mean, are there new opportunities that you cannot create alone? new models, new services that you have some of the ingredients to, but not all. And by working with another organization, can you take your peanut butter, combine it with your chocolate, and create something really tasty, right? Are there opportunities to grow funding by working together? So sometimes, our community funders have said, boy, and our federal funders have said, thou shalt work together or else not get funding, right? So that's the stick approach to collaboration, right? We want you to also think about working with your clients around the carrot approach, right? How might working with others be able to drive more resources, right? Your great work and their great work might be able to drive not only great work, but even more resources. And finally, how do we scale our work, right? We may not be able to grow into new markets and new communities, but by partnering with others, we can take our great program models and find new and different and additional homes for those models of service to be able to bring our great work in partnership with others to folks that wouldn't otherwise be able to receive it based on geographic access, based on where they are, based on transportation, whatever it may be. But these are some of the whys that we encourage you to sort of think about and encourage your boards and staff leadership. And as it was said by somebody, is it board led? Is it staff led? And the answer is yes, right? Ideally, board and staff are on the same page. This internal clarity needs to be shared, right? It cannot just be in the executive director or CEO's head. It can't just be in that board member's head. It's got to be shared, transparent, and ideally agreed upon, right? And so part of our role of consultants is really supporting processes that create a sense of shared reality that builds the case as to why.
And Jim, I just want to jump in on this slide. I mean, I think for those of us that are engaged in the conversation this afternoon that have done this work before, I think you can look across these whys and really think about client examples. Where it was about expansion, where it was about protecting programs. I think the piece for me that I also just want us to take away is that this conversation about strategic alliances, is not just for small organizations. And so when we're thinking about mid-sized organizations, when we're thinking about larger players in a particular ecosystem, this in fact should be something that nonprofits of all sizes are considering, because a lot of these whys speak to kind of how a larger player may actually partner with a smaller player. And so we are seeing what I would say is an uptick in larger players sort of seeking. They have their own whys, which may be about service continuums. It may be about geographic reach. It may be about expanding and serving new populations, to Jim's point. But there's a thoughtful way that large players can do this. And I think there's also thoughtful ways that large players cannot do this and actually create harm or in fact, maybe not be in service to the mission of a small nonprofit. And so for those of you that work with smaller to mid-size agencies, we certainly are aware of, like right now in Connecticut, people are getting calls, from larger players saying, hey, we were thinking, how are you doing in the pandemic? And, would you be interested in a conversation? And so, I'll just sort of say that the why is important, both no matter where you sit and no matter what your size is.
And two more things on the why. I mean, so, the corollary question is why not? And the reason why not is one reason why is if you can't come up with a why, or you can't come up between board and staff with an agreed upon why. And Ann and I were part of a merger that didn't happen in my state over the last year or so. It was in part because, where the board was and where the staff were and the organizations were in very different places as to the why. In some cases, the board didn't understand the why. And as a result, the arrangement never happened. And so, but if organizations cannot come up with a compelling why, that's probably a red flag or a flag to sort of say, boy, maybe this is not the right time, or maybe not the right circumstances to sort of pursue this, right? There are lots of other reasons, a brand new executive director or CEO jumping on board. Maybe you've had recent issues with the organization's had recent issues around sort of a financial mess or scandal or bad PR or skeletons that have just recently come out of the closet. So there are reasons why the answer may be why not or not to proceed. But the biggest one and most frequent one is if you can't come up with a compelling why, because these are not short journeys. I mean, the one that is closing today, the partner search started in the fall of 2019, and the letter of agreement was signed 16 months ago. I was engaged for nearly a year before I got married. That's a long time. right? And so these are, if you don't have a compelling why, it's really hard to get through the bumpy parts of the negotiations and the process. So knowing your why is probably the most important thing to sort of think about. So if you go to the next slide, we'll talk about some of the tools that you can use and techniques that you can use, I think, to get there. So again, as consultants, we can use those assessment tools. We can support them and help with sense making, right? Asking questions, right? Using our trust to sort of ask harder questions, right? Provide disconfirming information. So say, actually, we've done the stakeholder interviews and, your programs are not as well received, or boy, your programs are really, really appreciated. And there's great demand for more. You thought you were a small niche, but you're actually larger, that you actually can have more impact than you realize. And again, this is a journey. There is no speed dating. There is no speed process in this. These are very, very time consuming, because as was mentioned earlier, you're trying to get folks on board. You're trying to get them excited. And you're trying to get them to agree. Shared reality, shared understanding, shared commitment, shared passion is what makes this work happen. And so that doesn't happen overnight.
Yeah. Francesca asked a good question in the chat, which is even when there's a compelling why for a combination, how is it important to have mission, vision, values, alignment or not? And how do we meaningful assess and understand that? I think in terms of the journey, in some ways, Francesca, that we're laying out here, it's incredibly important as it relates to internal clarity that even before we're seeing if there's alignment with a partner, that we actually know and are clear of our own mission, vision, values. So, if you're working with an entity that is considering an alliance and they aren't aligned around their own mission, vision, values, that could be another piece of this internal clarity work. As we kind of seek to develop a potential partnership, mission, vision, values absolutely is an incredible part of that process. If you're doing a real consolidation like a merger, it is part of that process to really build a new mission, vision, values for the merged entity. But lots of other collaboration may not need that level of integration. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to structures. And so we just wanted to share with you an example of an entity's internal clarity. So oftentimes we are in fact asked early in a process to work with a nonprofit to really find a partner. And so oftentimes when we're doing partner search, internal clarity is actually a sort of a substantive front end of that, which is, who are we today? What's our size? What are we facing? What's on the horizon? And why would we consider a partnership? This particular entity in some ways really leaned into kind of their service offerings. They were a smaller, not human services provider that sort of had a niche offering to a very specific audience. They really wanted the ability to expand their community-based services. They really wanted to offer wraparound services. They felt as if they were able to offer some of that, but didn't really have the strong enough clinical infrastructure, and also wanted additional ancillary services for the clients that they served. They believed that their model, which was sort of tested in the market, was viewed as innovative and thought it had the sort of legs for scaling. And so finding a partner that could support or invest in that scaling was something they were interested in. And lastly, their board really did not have access to substantive relationships as it related to fund development and really didn't play that role. And they felt as if, as they looked at the horizon, that pivot was just too hard. Like that because of the culture of the board, that was just not possible. So looking at in terms of, they started to really think about, if we're going in some ways to kind of seek a partner, these are some of the things that we would be thinking about as to kind of what's our why. Our why is really about offering more to our clients. It's about scaling what we do. And ultimately, it's about sustainability and really the ability to support the work going forward. So what we were able to do, and I think this kind of conversation really actually translates right into kind of criteria for partners. But before you even get there, you've got to sort of be clear that these are the kinds of things that we're looking for and we're ready to go find a partner. So you can get to a why, the partnership is still a means to get there. In this particular instance, the organization was really open to kind of a range of structures, but really needed to build buy-in at the board level that this was the kind of the next set of steps to take. Jim, you want to come in here?
Yeah, I was gonna say, and you could probably create your own backstory, right? I mean, sort of to sort of help you as consultants sort of think about what the context might be, right? So maybe that last item about the small board of directors didn't have an access or networks to support fund development. Maybe the organization realized that it needed to diversify its revenue sources based on where state and public dollars were headed, right? And to continue to grow or develop, it needed to create a fund development component, but maybe they've been state funded or publicly funded and hadn't built that culture or capacity. Right? Maybe their client feedback had come back in terms of saying, boy, we love this, but we don't have that. And these are the pieces that we're getting from you, but we're not getting these components and services, and we would really benefit from that. So you can begin to sort of think about how you can use the context to sort of drive some of the questions that will get you to the why. And I think if you can remember 3 words for this first hour and a half, it's why before who, right? Mm-hmm. So when boards have this conversation, sometimes if the conversation sort of happens somewhat sort of prematurely, it's, well, we're going to keep our logo. Wait a second, are we going to keep our name? It's like, wait a second, let's go back here. Let's back up the truck and sort of say, wait a second, what is our why? So some folks like to jump really downstream, and our encouragement to you again is why before who.
So what we're going to do is just about 2:25, 2:26. We're just going to give you a 5-minute break and a 5-minute stretch. So go ahead and do that. Come back to us at about 2:30 if you can, 2:31. We're going to have you break into small groups again and really explore this concept of internal clarity with your colleagues. So take a quick break. We'll be back in 5. What we'd like you to do in this next section is we are going to break you into breakout groups again. But I think one of the things that you've heard Jim and I talk about is, that this is a journey, that it is based on conversations and good information and engaging stakeholders. And even before we're talking to partners, even before we're picking structures, even before we're making a strategic alliance happen, there's this enormous body of sort of pre-work and readiness that we as consultants and advisors can support. And so what we'd like you to do is sort of break into small groups and really explore, sort of from your vantage point, what are the kinds of supports that you've seen be successful? So for where you've seen this kind of work unfold, where, a board and CEO has come together kind of around this type of decision making or this type of decision more explicitly, what are the ways in which we as advisors have actually added value at this stage of the process? And what are some of the actual activities and approaches that you've seen be successful? So we've already heard some great examples, board level strategic partnership committees, Jim really suggesting that partnership discussion sort of sits on that board agenda, but really as consultants, what are the kind of tools or in your toolbox that you might bring to this really taking stock exercise and really seeking to build this internal clarity. So Monica, we're going to give folks about 10 minutes or so to talk with each other about what's the value that we can add in this sort of early stage part of the journey. We had a great discussion. I think to me, when we sort of designed this session and thought about these breakout group discussions and really thought about this journey that clients and grantees go on, and sort of came to these kind of prompts for the kind of you to talk with each other. To me, this is one of the most important ones, because I think all of you have tools in your toolbox that can support this kind of dialogue. And so I'm really excited to hear, from a few groups in terms of, in some ways, what you chatted about and what were some of the kind of tools and key takeaways and themes that you had from your discussion. You can unmute or raise your hand if you'd like to share.
This is Priya. I can share.
I see Priya. Yep.
Really, of the 4 people that were in the group, the other 3 hadn't had a lot of experience doing this. So I was able to chat a little bit longer than usual, but my perspective is different because I'm coming to this as an attorney, not as a consultant. Right. So the tools that I use when my clients, one or more of them, are at sort of the preliminary stages, first of all, I always recommend that they get the nonprofit merger workbook by La Piana Associates. I think it's really awesome. And even though it's sort of nerdy to really like go through a workbook, I really encourage both sides to do that because I think it highlights a lot of questions and issues that they might not otherwise think about.
Right.
I always advise them that the lawyers come in later. You know, the business people need to figure out what they want the deal to be. The lawyers don't drive the transaction, we reflect it in the work we do. I urge them to work with a consultant such as FIO Partners or another to sort of, the way I describe it is the transaction or the deal is the client rather than one party or the other. And so Anne or Jim or one of your colleagues or somebody from another firm can act sort of as the captain of the ship, help the parties come together, figure out what they need. And then the parties can retain their counsel, either through the pro bono partnership or otherwise. And I also remind them, as you have, you know, I say the legal piece is really sort of, in some regards, the easiest piece, you know, bringing together the cultures, the workplace, the workforce, employee benefits, you know, all those operational pieces are really often much more complicated and challenging than the legal piece. And I always, as you say, I urge them to think about why they're doing it. If they come like saying, we're going to do this with this other organization, it's like, whoa, let's chat a little bit. So those are just a few of the things that I mentioned.
Thanks so much, Priya. That's great. Francesca, you want to jump in?
Sure, and I want to thank the other participants in my group. It was a great conversation. And one of the questions that I raised, you know, and as we were talking about the different types of involvement that different stakeholders can be providing as part of the process of decision making and exploration, was really about those individuals who are the recipients of the service activities of the organizations, the organizations that are considering this type of affiliation or merger, and to what extent or how is their input, involvement, co-development, decision-making, whatever that stage of the process is, could be, should be, and how to support that to happen. So we ended up having a good conversation about that.
That's great, Francesca. And as you kind of explored that, were there any kind of emergent kind of options around a sort of inclusion of community members in whether it's a stakeholder listening exercise, but even beyond that, kind of inclusion in a board committee or inclusion of key community leaders actually in some of the decision-making bodies that sometimes drive these processes?
Well, those are all, what you've just identified are all great examples. And one of the things that we talked about was from the funders' perspective, that is something that funders could absolutely be interested in supporting to happen. And one of the, I think, follow-up questions to that then becomes, well, who initiates that, and how does that actually come up in the mix of those very complex sets of processes? So yes.
Awesome. Thank you so much for raising that up. Francine.
Unmute myself. Well, we talked about very early stage when you're kind of even deciding, after you've decided on the why, and then you're deciding who to date. And, you know, the question is what's in it for them and what's in it for you? So what's the value proposition for each of you very early on? And we also talked about that once you do decide who you're going to date, the consultant's role is many times just managing egos on both sides. So ego was a word that we talked about a lot. So anyway.
Well, thanks for that, Francine. I mean, I think the ego issue and issues of that sort also can actually play out in the internal clarity stage as well. You know, so oftentimes any entity is at risk of, you know, a board member with a specific agenda or a specific vision for the entity, or they've been on the board for 15 years and we tried this once and it didn't work. And so, you know, when we think about kind of acknowledging that our boards are groups and that anything that's going to play out on the partner side easily could play out for the entity even before we get there. Francine, did you want to jump back in?
I was just going to say, I mean, it goes down to even things like the org chart becomes such a sticky, you know, so you get down to that, you know, once you're in it, you know, that's
then you're really in it. Yes.
Then you're really in it.
True. Other takeaways from your conversation, sort of tools or approaches that you talked about in your small groups.
One of the things we talked about was, not rushing into merger, right?
Oh.
Trying it out in a less formal collaboration to see if there's going to be an alignment in culture and program and, in all the ways that you would want to function. And the facilitator or the advisor's role can be very helpful here to sort of put the brakes on a little bit, because I think that a lot of organizations just assume that end result. It has to be a merger somehow, but you really can start with something smaller, more discreet and manageable that can teach you a lot about whether a merger is in the cards.
Right. Thank for that. I love that idea of can we find kind of more formal ways to try out the relationship and get to know each other better before assuming that we should actually merge our entities. Great suggestion. Awesome. Other things that folks would like to jump in with?
And I'll just mention that
Sure.
in my experience, culture trumps strategy.
Mhm.
And if the cultures don't mesh, it will not work. You almost have to start there. I mean, the strategy can be elegant, but have all your org charts and flow charts and collaborations and dating and so forth. But sooner or later, you're going to realize that you're from two different worlds if the cultures aren't coming together.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we were chatting about, Robin, to your point about sort of cultures, is how well does this particular entity know itself? And so we talked a little bit about mission, vision, and values, and in these early stage conversations, talking about sort of what are our cultural beliefs? What do we believe about our work? What's our practice philosophy? How do we do our work? How do we view and partner with our community? Increasingly, we see entities that have strong sort of community-centered cultures, and we have others that are not. You can be in one entity and sort of community voice can be a huge driver in decision-making, and you can go down the street to another entity and say, have you been including the community or those that receive your services, and kind of deciding what happens next? And there can still be pretty awkward silence and be like, oh, no, we get contracts and we deliver against the contract. And you're like, okay, so you're a very different entity than the entity down the street. And so this thing about talking about what's important to us, and again, can all be part of these internal clarity discussions. The other thing that we were chatting a little bit about was, I am sure many of you may support strategic planning processes. A lot of the tools that you use in planning can be supportive of this internal clarity work. And so even when you're doing planning, if you're looking at the financials or you're engaging external stakeholders, a lot of those same activities can be used to inform some of this finding our why in terms of a potential strategic alliance. And so, you could do interviews with key funders around, if this organization were to consider an alliance, who would you suggest, or what would you like to see them do? I think in a lot of ways, you all have probably a lot of tools, and whether it's facilitation or it's financial analysis or it's engaging stakeholder voice, all of that can be used to build shared reality as to why a potential strategic alliance could be pursued. Any other tools or approaches that folks would like to throw in the mix? Let's go down to Thomas. You're driving, be safe, and jump in.
Yes.
I will be safe. Yeah, I was just bringing up in our group the concept of kind of the drivers and the why question for the strategic alliance. And so a lot of it seemed to be kind of reactive in terms of the why. For example, funding cuts, the pandemic impacts,
Sure.
High turnover of leadership, disengaged board, whatever it is. But I was trying to flip it to a more proactive conversation about things that you're not reacting to. So for example, if you have a situation where it could be more of a customer driven, exercise. And
Yeah.
so as part of that, you do the needs assessment to figure out what the needs are. You do your assets mapping to see what's out there to meet those needs. Because a lot of people, navigation
Oh, Thomas, we're losing you.
And going through many systems, creates have reached the outcome that everybody would like them to get to. But sorry, there has to be more effort put in customer own way. That can lead to
Yeah, he's cutting in, Thomas, you're cutting in a little. Oh, okay. Hey, Thomas, you're cutting in and out a little bit, but I think the summary there was really listening to customer feedback and really using that as kind of a driver for a why. So really looking at what services are offered in our region, thinking about what assets there also are, and is there an opportunity or a strategic market opportunity through a partnership that could actually meet some of those market needs. I think I got it. But don't stop driving and tell us. Other folks want to jump in before we move on to the next section? Okay. I think this is about building shared reality, and that's a term that FIO uses a lot in our work around really helping stakeholders take stock about where they are and really set a strong foundation for moving in the direction of pursuing a strategic alliance. What I want to do now is sort of jump back over to the slides and in some ways talk through a little bit about this sort of next section, which is once you're sort of clear on criteria, and really in some ways have thought a little bit about what would our why be, how do we in some ways move into this idea of the who. So Jim has really driven this home, kind of this get your why down before you start thinking about the who. And I think, for us, the who is about relationships. This is about people. It's about the trust that has been built over time between leaders. It is about the trust that can be built in new relationships between board members and sometimes through these processes. But as we're thinking about our own why, we often start and recommend really a relational mapping tool. Really where an organization lists all of its collaborators, its competitors, its peers, people who refer to the organization or who may not refer to or kind of who do you refer out to. That in some ways is the ecosystem of relationships where strategic alliances are possible. It really represents a baseline, and you really can in fact rank those relationships. Who do you know well? Who do you have high trust with? Who have you had good experiences with? For organizations that are really beginning their journey around seeking a partnership, this kind of ecosystem work reminds them that it's much easier, and at least in our work, to create a partnership where you already have some pre-existing relationship, some trust that has been built over time, relationships that really initiate at the point of a particular potential partnership really have to build in all that trust building. So when you've mapped your relationships, there may be some players that really pop out that could be really deeply aligned to your particular client in terms of a potential partnership. And it's about, in some ways, taking stock of those relationships and then in some ways shortlisting a set that say, you know what, if we were going to pursue a partnership that's aligned with our why, these 4, 5, 6 entities may be folks that we want to go talk with. And so we really start with that mapping sort of process. The other thing that we really recommend is really the establishment of some criteria. So once you've kind of mapped the ecosystem, you've really thought about your why, and you've really said, well, who could help us do some of these things? Who could help us, in the case of my example earlier, scale this particular approach that we have to this certain type of programming? Which of these players, in some ways has a large sustainable business model or geographic reach? And this is sort of the process of partner search. So it's criteria, it's developing a short list of organizations to approach, and it's about leadership cultivation. And I think for some of you, this concept of collaboration and partnership may be much less formal than this, but I will tell you, there are many small to mid-sized nonprofits that would like to partner and need a little bit more of a structured approach to kind of how will we get there. Without some kind of formal approach, you sort of run into things like, the CEOs will like, well, I know Mark down the street and I've got a good relationship with Susan on the other side of town. So we're only going to talk to Mark and Susan, which which may be the right answer. But if the board isn't brought along in a process and the board doesn't understand why Mark and Susan were selected or shortlisted, you could have a board member that's like, I don't understand. How did we get here? I don't think we should move forward. And not because it's not the right answer, but it's because they weren't brought along in some type of formal journey to kind of build that buy-in. So it's criteria, it's shortlist, it's initial reach outs and cultivation to really understand if organizations would be interested in participating either in a partner search or really just, starting a conversation. So this can be very organic and formal, or it can actually be a formal request for partnership. So we've run a number of what I would say are kind of partner search processes that are somewhat formal, where a group of 8 or 10 organizations are identified. They're then shortlisted. We do some research around each one of them, and the board may select a potential partner to potentially to move into negotiations with. And so when we're thinking about the criteria that may make sense for a particular why, and you guys can jump into the chat on this one. What are, we could be looking at the strengths of the current relationship as a criteria. We could look at financial sustainability. Usually if you're doing a partner search, both partners need to sign at a minimum an NDA to at least exchange, and that's a non-disclosure agreement to exchange financial information. You may be thinking about alignment with current programming, be it similar or complementary, geographic presence and reach, or specific key management capacities or strengths. And so when we think about criteria, it really is aligned to what we're trying to accomplish. But the development of the criteria, the approval of the criteria should actually be done in as transparent as a way as possible with a board. So boards really understand we're looking for a partner. We've decided to look for a partner. There's our why. These are the kinds of things we're looking for, and that a board can be brought along in that journey. And there really could be other criteria that could be added. And so feel free to kind of jump into the chat, Jim. I'm not sure if folks have added some other thoughts here, but there could be any limitless number of criteria really that we could be thinking about depending on what our why might be. I think Francesca makes a great point from earlier, which is community involvement and community voice. They could be something that you've done a lot of and maybe your partners haven't, or vice versa, and could be an important part of whatever the partnership may be designed going forward.
Amy, in the chat, understanding all organizations are different, but is there a general estimate of time that an organization should consider for the criteria identification part of the process?
This shouldn't take that long. If we spent a lot of time on getting to the why, the criteria should sort of jump out in the sense of, I'll kind of use the example from earlier, with that particular entity, we had about 10 to 12 organizations on a short list. The CEO and board chair did initial conversations to get to a more kind of a shorter list, but the criteria, it was a board conversation. It was probably one meeting to finalize the kind of general criteria, just to sort of say, what are the kinds of, what's on our wish list? What would we love to have? Which is kind of in some ways what it ends up being. People sort of saying, we really want someone with a lot of management infrastructure. We really want someone, that may have shared values or a similar program portfolio. There really could be, but it shouldn't take a ton of time to get to criteria. I think,
Anne?
Yeah, go ahead.
There was a program several years ago that ended up kind of closing up shop through the Boston Foundation. Several foundations got together, and I believe it was called the Genesis program.
Okay.
And it was to help fund mergers. And what you had to go to them with a merger partner.
Yeah.
And I had several conversations with them about the fact that picking a merger partner normally takes 45 days. It requires, an outside consultant, but not for that long. They never made that transition, but selecting your partner is more complicated than just putting your finger on one agency.
Absolutely, absolutely more complicated. And I would definitely say, as it relates to the selection of a merger partner, you know, Jim talked a little bit about timelines. I mean, from a point of readiness to seek a partner to signing a potential, at least agreement to negotiate, could be 6 or 7 months just to get to that place. And so, you know, these things do not typically happen quickly. And I think the other piece that I would add is that, you know, as it relates to funding this work, I will say there's a little bit of a bright spot. There are a number of entities, I think, that understand that this pre-work and the selection of a partner is really important work to fund if you want to sort of land the plane. And so, you know, we see partners like the Hartford Foundation, as well as Sea Change, which is a foundation that's based in New York City, that will actually fund partner feasibility and will actually fund partner search as well. So I'm happy to say, I think in the funding community, there is a bit of a recognition that you've got to fund not only the implementation of these, you've actually got to fund the front end work as well. But let's sort of shift gears. I think in so many ways, you know, we've talked a little bit about the tools and approaches we can use. We can talk about internal clarity and start to get to the who of this. I think the excitement on the call is like, actually, let's build some of these things. And so I'm going to go back to the slides, and Jim and I are going to do a little bit of a yin and yang, and hopefully not bore you too much, and really share sort of some of these structures with you so that you can sort of get a flavor for, if we're clear about a why, you know, what's the means to actually bring that particular type of partnership to fruition. So we're going to take a look at some structures, just again as an introductory sort of overview. And so Jim, take it from here.
Well, again, you've seen this before, but again, we're really going to sort of more focus on the right side of the continuum. So these are, again, we've talked about playing in the sandbox well, we've talked about sort of these informal partnerships around service delivery, and we're really going to sort of focus on the right side of the continuum here in terms of closer to sort of the mergers and the legal reconfiguration. And again, consolidation sounds, that's a sort of a challenging term. It works alliteration wise, but I think in some ways, merging doesn't mean you have to get smaller, right? Merging mean you can also, combining can also mean that you can grow and get bigger. So, Annie, go to the next slide.
Yeah. And so this is a little bit about sort of purpose defines work, defines structure, and structure breeds behavior. So we're going to talk about structures. And we've talked about the why, but one of the things we haven't leaned into just yet is the type of work. So Jim?
Sure. So part of this is really about what is the combined entity, or what is the combination of work to be done, right? Is it, and when you're talking to another organization, is it simply to sort of, let's make sure that we are coordinating our activities so we're not both using the park for our festivals on the same weekend, right? Or maybe we are driving voter registration, which requires a high degree of coordination, training, collaboration, no duplication, no voter fraud, everybody signing up just once and only once, right? So it's really a matter of sort of first defining what is the nature of the work to be done. And then how much authority, or how much of that authority or central authority is needed to actually support that work. So if it's a matter of simply coordinating which days we use the park, we don't need to sort of give up a whole lot of power. We just need to really communicate, right? There doesn't need to be a coordinating body. We just need to sort of, we don't need a task force. We don't need a team of board members to sort of govern that. We don't need to change legal authority and create new structures. But as we get sort of, you know, further down the continuum, and we need to sort of coordinate more, and maybe it's around voter registration, where we need to make sure that everyone is trained in multiple locations in the same way, using the same forms, using the same protocols, making sure that we're not duplicating efforts. You definitely need more of a central authority, and maybe you will need some memorandum of agreement to make sure that you're operating in your territory or your zone, et cetera. So really, as Ann said, you know, the work defines the structure, not the opposite. So lots of boards and lots of EDs, in fact, sort of jump to structure. And we really sort of say, what is the work to be done? Are we looking to sort of integrate services? Are we looking to simply have services occur on the same day or different days in the same place, right? All of those, where you land on that set of types of questions really drives the question of central authority and structure, right? So the more coordinated, the more integrated, the more intertwined, the more complex, the more central authority you need. The more informal, the more sort of more level of coordination, the less central authority that you need.
And so one of the things that's important to recognize as we talk about the types of work, and so we've been using some examples around sort of internal clarity for our why, for a potential strategic alliance. We've talked about the types of partners and building criteria for who can help us get there. And I think some of us are we can make a lot of assumptions here that mergers are the easiest thing to talk about. But what I really want to have you realize is that the structure of the combination or the structure of the partnership really needs to get decided all the way at the end. And so what you've got to really understand is what's the work that we're trying to do with this particular partner when we think about our why. So is it pooled? Meaning, I offer a set of services. It's very similar to my partner. I'm going to keep doing what they're doing. I'm going to keep doing what I'm going to do. They're going to do what they're going to do. And it's going to add up to kind of more mission impact. So this is when two like organizations really can come together around a project or really bring their entities together, pooled. Is it sequential? Is this about handoffs? Am I going to offer one set of services and my potential partner offers another set of services and a client would really sort of sequence through what we offer? Or is this a basketball team? Are we actually envisioning that our work requires a little bit of this organization, a little bit of that organization, a little bit of maybe a third organization, and everything gets handed off, right? And so when you think about those different types of work, you have to realize the management structures, the culture of doing that work together, they actually are really different. So the amount of coordination, and we'll give you a couple of elements to also think about here. Jim, you want to talk about these or want me to jump in?
Sure, I'll give it a shot here. So task integration, again, if you think about the three types of work, very much if you think about that basketball model, there is a whole lot of task integration. There's going to be a lot of sort of sharing of roles and a lot of overlap of activities as opposed to you do your thing, I do my thing, right? So that pooled approach, right? I'll work on this thing and you work on that thing. And ideally, at the end of the day, clients will get what they need, right? So maybe that's just around referrals that involve sort of not even a warm handoff, right? So not a lot of overlap. And so the task integration can be either really intensive if the work is really intertwined or not so much if the work is much more sort of parallel play, if you will. Coordination costs as well. How much time does it take to sort of assign tasks across boundaries? How much time need to be spent in meetings to make sure that that things are being coordinated and information is flowing correctly, and that folks know their roles, and that rules are being followed, and that protocols are being adopted, and how much time is needed to really just sort of communicate, right? So is this a one and done? I'll use the park today, you use the park tomorrow, or and that's the nature of the work. And at the end of the day, everybody will get what they need when they come to the park. You'll get your meals today, you'll get your school bag tomorrow, whatever it may be. And coordination is really around how much overlap of work has to happen in terms of just to make sure that the systems all work. And then the degree of knowledge transfer is really sort of how much information do we actually have to share about what each other does? How much do I need to know about your work and how much do you need to know about my work? So the medical or mental health or behavioral health or the health environment is a good example of sort of a high degree of knowledge transfer, right? We need, if you're working in behavioral health organizations, the psychiatrist needs to understand aspects of the social work, and social work needs to understand some of the basics about the medications. So you need to be able to really understand the nature of what each other does in a deep way and share that information in terms of the actual nature of the work itself. And so depending on how much of that occurs and how much of that doesn't occur really will drive sort of structure. But again, it gets back to sort of what is the work to be done. And so Sarah writes in the chat that just disappeared, how much of this coordination work does FIO partners do? And if you don't do this work, who does? So
we do all of it.
Yeah, go ahead, Dave. Go ahead, Anne.
Yeah, I think, Sarah, we do all of this. So when you think about the coordination work as it relates to kind of all of this front end support in terms of building internal clarity, supporting a potential partnership, we do all of that work. I think there may be some colleagues on the line today who also probably do some of these pieces.
Right, and helping to decipher the nature of the work is really what's most important here, because the nature of the work will drive the structure, not vice versa.
Right.
And so really needing to unpack it all is really critical. So what are we trying to achieve and why? And then sort of what is the nature of the work that needs to occur?
So think about it from the standpoint that, you may have an organization that's coming to the table and saying, I need to find a merger partner. And really what they actually want is help with back office. You can get a back office agreement or a management services agreement with a larger entity without merging your entity. And we'll talk more about those structures, but that's why being clear about the why and the work is so critical, because if it's really just, having someone provide some infrastructure to a smaller entity, you can do that and you don't have to merge, because that work in some ways is somewhat, you can really kind of peel it off from the kind of the main entity and have someone help you with it. And that's a strategic alliance, that it's not a merger. You don't actually have to change your legal structures to get that kind of support. So when we're talking about this idea of hierarchical control, what we're really talking about is how many of the pieces and parts of the elements of both entities need to be controlled. If we're talking about, really joining programs and putting together program participants and program staff, and that's our why to do this, you need a lot of control to do that. You can't just sort of willy-nilly be like, oh, we'll just keep our separate offices and keep running our separate programs. And that doesn't work, right? So you've got to be clear about the work. And so even if it's a light strategic alliance, we do recommend things like making sure we have some operating procedures for how we'll communicate, how will we address disputes, and how we'll be compensated. And so again, this idea of what is the work and how much control do we need to have about our shared work is a really important part of understanding the spectrum of options. This is not a one-size-fits-all conversation. And understanding the work to be done with a set of partners helps inform how it should be supported, how should it be structured, and if there need to be agreements amongst the partners, this is how you get there, is by truly understanding what is it the work that we're going to do together. And so just to kind of shift gears though, so again, to kind of what are some of these structures, I think Jim and I are just going to try to hit the high points so that we can have still some time for reflection and questions before we close out today. So as it relates to the structures, here's some pictures of what are called joint ventures. And so this is when nonprofits come together in kind of a constellation of ways to do something together. So think about on the top left, you have a joint venture manager, where you may have some contractual agreements between two nonprofits who are going to maybe provide services to another nonprofit in a particular program. So we have a little venture, it might be a new program that we're doing together. Nonprofit 3 is kind of holding the program, and we're actually going to do some contracts to support program delivery. On the bottom, you have an example of 3 nonprofits who have come together. This is a good example of actually 3 nonprofits who came together to share their training function. And so they developed a partnership agreement that really kind of brought all 3 entities together, really just around their training function. They had some guidelines around how they'd share materials, who would kind of own the intellectual property and all those types of pieces. But it was really just a way for those 3 entities to do something together. You also have the creation of an entity, which is over here in the incorporated joint venture. So actually here in Connecticut, we actually have an example where nonprofits have come together and actually created an electronic medical record company that they are the owners of. And so think about having an incorporated for-profit entity where these 3 nonprofits are actually the owners of that. So you can also have that type of coming together. So joint venture models don't impact the legal structures of these entities. They remain somewhat autonomous, and you're using contracts and agreements to bring a joint project, program, or venture together.
And just to offer a service example for the one on the right, I was part of a group that with a behavioral health organization, an organization that works with kids with autism, and an organization that works with kids with developmental disabilities and physical disabilities, to create a care coordination program for Medicaid for all kids with disabilities, right? That was family-led, family-driven, and family-supported. So again, there are business ventures. It ended up being a limited liability corporation. Board members from three organizations were on board. They shared the investment, they shared the return. But again, you also have service examples of these incorporated joint ventures. At one point, one partner bowed out. And it moved to really actually the upper left and ultimately to the lower left. And so these things can also morph and merge and morph over time.
Yeah. So these are management service organizations. And so this is when, if you think about on the right-hand side, this is where you may have a large nonprofit that actually creates a management services division to offer through contracts management services to a set of nonprofits. This is not an unusual model. One of the biggest examples of MSO model here in New England is Third Sector New England, otherwise known as Mission Works. They provide fiduciary back office supports to nonprofits. And again, these are so basically it's contractual in some cases. Over there on the left, you also can see nonprofits come together to create their own management service organization. So in this case, the nonprofits sit on the board of the MSO. The MSO actually has its own staff. So this is where we might see a shared fund development and marketing function that gets created to support a set of nonprofits. And again, so where management services sit and are managed is sort of an entire kind of body of thinking in the sector around how can you actually take the infrastructure of larger entities or build infrastructure in service to a set of autonomous or independent entities. Another good example of this is actually the United Way system. In certain parts of the country, there are clusters of United Ways that actually have shared infrastructure, but autonomous organizations. So think about that all the databases are held centrally. They might do HR centrally, physical plant centrally, but actually remain autonomous entities distributed across a geographic region.
Networks.
Lots of slides on networks.
Yeah, so really we see this in terms of service networks. We see this in terms of continuums of care. These allow for single points of entry to multiple services, oftentimes allow us to integrate services across organizational boundaries for individuals, so that no wrong door, right? They provide their information once and they're available to all of this. We even see this with library networks, right? So in my state and probably your state, the idea that you have, all the libraries sort of connected, you can kind of, you're when you go to one, you're really at all, right? And the same here. It helps to improve quality across multiple organizations at once. That lead agency can also oftentimes set standards, requirements for participation in the network, protocols, et cetera, that bring everybody up to a level of quality and data management and quality improvement. We've seen this in some states as they look to sort of contract with fewer organizations, right? So there was 75 or 80 child welfare organizations in the state of Connecticut and state of Rhode Island, and they wanted to go to 2 that they dealt with, that the state did. So 2 large networks formed with lead agencies and set up protocols, and then the state a couple years later decided never mind. And there's been talk about this in Connecticut around developmental disability providers at points in time to sort of consolidate, and state government oftentimes finds this as an opportunity to really sort of collapse the number of contracts it has to manage and delegate authority and oversight to these lead agencies. So we see these here, we see them in coalitions, we see them in public policy and trade associations. Go ahead, Ann, I'm sorry.
Yeah, and I was just going to jump in. There's a good example of this in Connecticut, which is the Connecticut Family Service Agencies. It's an association of the family service agencies in the state that manage a number of state contracts through the Family Service Agency sort of network. But there is a hub that holds that network, and then the services are delivered by the members of the network. We have a few examples of how this can be done. So as it looks at sort of the other kind of options, again, we're kind of increasing the complexity here as we talk about these. This is the parent corporation model, where in some cases you may see a larger parent corp with a subsidiary entity. There's a lot of kind of elements that are attractive to subsidiary relationships. A smaller nonprofit may be able to retain its name, it retains its board, it may retain certain elements of its programmatic work. It can get support around some of its infrastructure, but basically becomes a wholly owned subsidiary of another nonprofit. So as we are sometimes thinking about a journey to merger, the parent subsidiary model is sometimes a model that's considered as a step on the way to full merger. A non-traditional version of the parent corporation is when you actually see subsidiaries as well as other entities under a parent. So you might see for-profit businesses as subsidiaries. You may see nonprofit subsidiaries as well as foundations. And so again, a subsidiary model is a way to bring in an entity into kind of an umbrella organization, in some ways allowing it to also retain its brand and autonomy in some cases.
And then we have what we've been talking about. You know, we use the word merger all the time, and really what we're talking about, you know, is one aspect of these kinds of relationships. So we've gone through a whole bunch of different models, and here we are at merger, acquisition, or amalgamation. And this is really, again, change of legal structure, where on the right side, something brand new is created. So organization X, organization Y come together and they decide to create a brand new organization, organization Z, right? And so it is a, you know, maybe the board is 50-50, you know, maybe it's co-directors or one of the directors doesn't stay on, but it's a brand new, on the right-hand side, it's a brand new legal entity, right? It's something that legally did not exist before. On the left side, and there are reasons for that, and on the left side, you know, is a situation where it's more of a, maybe more of an acquisition. You know, the nature of some relationships are more acquisition as opposed to merger. That sort of has to do with sort of debt and liabilities and some of the economics, oftentimes the economics of the deal. But where one organization becomes part of another organization. We've all heard of examples of sort of folks becoming part of larger organizations and sort of being subsumed, and their bylaws go away, they legally dissolve. The Vantage Group, again, the close today with Mosaic is today, it's all public. The Vantage Group will dissolve over the next 6 to 9 months. They will go away, their board will go away, their assets will go away, their nonprofit certificate will be sort of metaphorically turned in, and they will be part of a larger organization. That work will continue, the work will persist, the staff will stay on, and services will continue to be provided. So lots of even different models around how acquisition, merger, or amalgamation can really occur. And again, where does this fit in around sort of potentially eliminating excess capacity, driving economies of scale, potentially reducing duplication of efforts, capturing multidisciplinary approaches, et cetera. So again, what you want to accomplish will sort of drive the model you ultimately end up with in terms of the legal structure at the end of the game.
And so the other kind of, we just shared with you, and I'm not going to spend a ton of time here, but the third handout that we did share with you is from 2 entities. It was adult day provider with really a community of nursing facilities, as well as assisted living for seniors. And so we just shared it with you as an example of sort of 2 partners coming together and exploring their rationale for deeper negotiations. And you know, we don't have to spend a ton of time on it, but I wanted you to at least see one example of 2 partners. And it's also important to recognize that the resulting structure that was chosen from that example is actually was a parent subsidiary model. So, you know, part of this was for the larger entity, which was the senior community, was about actually adding adult day services to its continuum of care. And so in this instance, this particular adult day provider was brought in as a subsidiary of the larger entity. So just wanted to give you just an example of a rationale to take a look at. And then just, you know, the structure they ended up picking was not a merger, but was in fact a parent subsidiary model. And so I think what we'd like to do is really just, you know, we have sort of time together, you know, to move kind of back into small groups one more time before we sort of begin to kind of bring this to fruition and have some more Q&A. But what we want you to do is again, thinking about this concept of the recognition of the importance of the internal clarity. Why would we do this? What is the work to be done? What are some of the structural options that we have to choose from? And why might we choose them? And so it is about this kind of like thinking about this as a continuum. It's a journey. But what we want to do is break you into small groups. And I'm going to kind of pull up the question. You know, this is really about sort of asking ourselves, you know, when we're thinking about this, you know, how can we kind of talk about some of the partnerships that we have seen and sort of what was the type of work to be done in that particular partnership, and how did it inform the structure of the partnership? You know, and again, some of you may have some limited experience with this, but I'm hoping kind of to lean on those of you in the room that have done this a few times or been exposed to it, to just talk with each other about where we've seen a couple of entities, you know, kind of come together how did they get clear about their own work, and what was the actual kind of structure that they ended up choosing. But before we jump in to do that, I just want to get a read on the room. Do folks feel comfortable kind of going in to have that conversation? Just kind of give me a thumbs up or a thumbs down. Thumbs up, thumbs up. All right, we're kind of down to about 20 folks, so I think it's okay. Monica, can we break into small groups? Welcome back, all. Our ranks have gotten smaller, which is fine, but I'm happy to, I want to just kind of create some space and to hear from folks around kind of this question around, you know, the types of partnerships that you've seen come to fruition, and a little highlights from your discussion. Anybody want to jump in? We're a small group at this point, so feel free to unmute and kind of share some of the highlights from your dialogue.
Well, we talked a little bit about the fact that there haven't been a lot of mergers going on in this pandemic period, and Priya can maybe speak to that. But I was with the Y for 25 years and kind of beta tested a date before you marry model. Where we took over at the Torrington Y took over back office operations, and then slowly melted programs.
Yeah.
And in my experience, that has been an effective way to get boards to kind of get their toes in the water,
sure,
and not feel like they're all in. And I didn't get to this with the group, but the barrier is disposition of assets. That it seems to always become the most challenging issue that comes to the table. They can deal with a lot of other stuff, but that who owns what and who has more money than the other. So.
Well, we've certainly seen challenges around debt and transfer of debt and financial institutions. So whether it's an asset or it's a debt, you can really actually have banks just say, no, we're not going to transfer the mortgage. And when they say no, the partners are forced to deal with paying it off. And if one partner doesn't want to, you can't get the deal done. So, thanks for that, Thomas, as well. Just sort of the mechanics of this on the other side, particularly around mergers. We were chatting at the break that it is impossible for us to try to convey in 3 hours the nuances of what happens after you've chosen a partner and after you move into implementation to kind of get these kind of partnerships to come to fruition. It can be a long, complex exercise, or as Jim is finding in one of our current clients, it can be about 30 days if it's an asset acquisition and it's not complex and it's small entities. So there's still a lot of variability on the other side of making these choices. But other highlights from the groups. Oh, Jim, you want to jump in?
I would just add, you're in a more powerful position than you think, because no bank wants a front page story that they are closing down a nonprofit. So
very true.
Good.
I was going to simply say that the challenge, so the back office sort of as a step one or as a beta tester, as a first date is a great idea. Just if you go down that road, make sure that the organization that's offering that actually understands sort of client service or business service, because back office supports oftentimes struggle with multiple demands competing for its resources and aren't always sort of customer service oriented. And so you also want that first date to be a really positive experience, like we do with all of our first dates.
Yep.
Absolutely.
One of the models I was pretty impressed with is what the family service agencies did in Fairfield County. And I don't know whether they've done it in other parts of the state, where they divided up, it's like, okay, there were Greenwich, Stamford, Norwalk, and Bridgeport all had family service agencies covering the county. And they divided up particular services. So one might do foster care, another one might do home-based services, another one might do Meals on Wheels, and another one might provide behavioral health services. And they divided those up between them, and they made an agreement with them so that they weren't managing 4 separate programs, but each agency took responsibility for it. And I thought that was a real good example of networking where they formed alliances and had MOUs to pull it off.
That's great. Thanks, Bob. Great example. And again, I think it's important in Bob's example that they didn't change their legal structures. They made agreements and used memos of understanding. So it's when we think about this spectrum, that's actually pretty light touch, and my bet is pretty impactful for those families in that community that one organization was kind of the hub for a particular set of services. So great example, Bob. Thank you. Other comments from your conversations or questions that you might have?
I'll just make a comment.
Sure.
I didn't bring this up in the breakout, but it's 2 conversations with executive directors of larger nonprofits in Fairfield County that I'll never forget about merger. And it was during a time when there was a lot of merger activity happening in 2008. And both of these executive directors, when I talked to them about mergers with smaller organizations, and we actually started, thinking, just having the conversation about where is that something that was on their kind of horizon. Both of these executive directors said to me that there was no structure that they could really entertain with specific smaller organizations. They were much more interested in seeing, they were much more interested about what would happen sort of after the organization went out of business. So they didn't want to inherit what they thought were really significant liabilities. And although there were some assets that the organization had, which could have been a really exemplary staff person, 2 funding relationships that were unusual and important. But both of these executive directors said that they were looking at the opportunity of an acquisition, and they didn't want it while the organization was alive, but they would be okay after the organization had passed on, because there were some really great things they could be picked up. And it wasn't said in a negative way. I mean, it was just said, look, very matter-of-factly, that was how they preferred to think about the acquisition or the connection with this smaller organization. And I just remember those conversations so vividly, because it was.
Well, but at the same time, it's so deeply troubling. I mean, I think there is a perspective that, you could just wait for all these small entities to close or dissolve or struggle or struggling. But I'll be candid. I mean, I think it's not a surprise to me at all, Karen, because it basically is the power structure in the sector.
Right.
That larger entities who are more well-funded and more able to garner state contracts, large philanthropic dollars, want to protect their positions in whatever markets they're operating in. The problem we have is that those small entities that are offering community-based services or uniquely community-driven or community-formed solutions might actually be working, in some ways are blocked and not able to access those funding streams. And so we end up with services that communities don't want, that aren't informed by their own practices, culture, and norms. And we end up with small nonprofits that can't survive. So I guess what I would say is that conversation, yes, that's exactly what is happening. My question becomes is, how do we help large nonprofits in those seats understand that there's ways to do this in ways that would actually advance their own mission and support their communities? And so,
and
there's a lot to unpack there.
And I think address the issue, the fear that the executive director has, which is not me as a grant maker to question. I'm not the executive director. That there were specific liabilities and risks that the larger nonprofit did not want to absorb and take on. And so,
and the crazy part is that what I love about this dialogue is that this is the knowledge gap that we have. because there are ways to acquire assets where you don't take the liabilities with you, where you leave them behind, and the larger entity would not have to take them on or deal with them. But you could protect the program, you could protect the unique funding stream, you could bring in the really interesting, creative, programmatic solution, and actually leave all of the liabilities behind. And so to me, it's this combination of, what's the advocacy strategy for larger nonprofits to say, there's a way to do this that you're not going to take on more risk than you're willing to. And in fact, how do we actually shift that mindset? So it's a knowledge.
There may be a need for training there, Anne.
Yeah, I think so.
Well,
that might be a conversation.
And it's also an opportunity to reframe. So, I mean, essentially what those folks are saying is we're going to wait until people that need services go without services and can't get those services from their trusted provider anymore before we think about potentially providing those services for those folks, people they don't know and haven't worked with before and are not familiar with their organization. I mean, I think that if it's about the assets, that's one thing. If it's about the people that they presumably were formed to serve, it's another. And so I think it's an interesting, fraught conversation to both of your points. Other comments, questions?
If I can just pick up on just where you just were, Jim, and also what Karen was saying. I was part of an organization on senior management for about 15 years that closed in 2017 just due to severe funding changes because their funding model was so state of Connecticut government contract based, and then we had that very hard spring of 2017, and up until then, during those 15 years, they twice attempted. The first would have been an actual merger of relative equals, and then the one closer to that timeline would have been being acquired by a much larger organization. And both times it didn't happen because of culture. And the first time it was mutually agreed, not culture. And the second time, I think that what I saw as I saw it play out was that the large nonprofit organization kind of necessarily was like a business, very much like a business, not about little pockets of culture. And the small one, us, was absolutely a family. It's like, that's what the draw was, to be in this place that had low compensation. It's, relatively speaking, all these kinds of things. So that the big one would have gone perfectly through with it because it was like an acquisition, like maybe you see in the general sense of acquisitions, but the smaller one could not tolerate the idea of losing themselves into it. And that's what I got at before. They didn't know that right around the corner was going to be this huge deficit problem, but they knew that that was the risk. And they couldn't go through with because they couldn't give up what they had.
I mean, I think we could probably spend, I was with days talking about the examples of where it has worked. I mean, I think that, Jim and I, the deal we were talking about earlier, it came down to governance. And yes, it was a little bit about culture, but it was more so about the culture of governance that ended up being the deal breaker, which was just not something that they could move past. And so at the end of the day, this issue of culture, practices, and norms, and ultimately some people really are literally unwilling to change the practice or unwilling to be able to see a particular practice from the other entity's point of view. And it's enough to blow up a deal. And I think, what we were sort of chatting about at the break is we apologize that we only had 3 hours. I mean, this is really complex work. The early stage work and getting to internal clarity is a journey that I think any kind of strong facilitative consultant with kind of a good ability to raise information can take someone through. Getting on the other side is another sort of, is a whole other skill set in some ways, and kind of knowledge base to help people sort of choose the structure, to actually work with attorneys to do the agreement, to do the due diligence. There's a whole other lot of things. And that's really only when you're doing a merger, that there's a lot more that we could kind of cover on. But we'll stop talking. Any other questions folks have? I know we're seeing folks jump off and we're getting to the end, but if you've come with a burning issue and we didn't get to it today, I'm sorry, but we're happy to stay on for a few minutes if we can be helpful.
I don't know if it's not really a question. I'm just welcome your thoughts. I'm working with several small organizations, and I know small organizations, right? But everyone's under extraordinary stress, and these are organizations that have incredibly thin teams. So really, you have ED or a CEO who's driving this, but often a really recalcitrant staff below them that either has always been disconnected, not necessarily really involved in agency decision-making or governance, don't want to see changes happening. And that leadership position, which can be hard and lonely as it is, to bring their team along and educate them and update them and bring the board along. And it's like they need a buddy, right? They need a buddy, they need a trusted colleague, and they need someone internally who's kind of rah-rahing, right? The change is okay, and this is okay, and we can get there. So it's not all sitting on that kind of one position to do all this. And it makes me very worried about these smaller organizations, just the amount of stress on them, even when they're trying to move forward. It's tremendous.
Yeah.
I was gonna say, one of the biggest questions and challenges for executive directors of any size organization is what to share and when, right? And that is, there is no, so sometimes that's dictated by the arrangement you make with the other organization and where they are, but it is one of the hardest things to sort of figure out along the way. Because to your point, they are alone. They've disappeared. They're talking to other folks. It's sort of, for months on end. And then emotionally, when it's time to share with folks, they've gone through the journey, right? But no one else has. And so there's also that piece as well. And so I definitely agree with you that having that emotional support in terms of, executive directors having been one, lots of things you can't share with lots of people. This one is hard. And I think the other is, and this is why getting to that why is so important, because people will make it about themselves, they'll make it about their jobs, they'll make it about their security. Whenever we do sort of FAQs for staff when things are about to happen, it's always couched based on what does it mean for them, right? There's a very little bit about the why, which we have to put in there, but it's like, will your job change? Will your benefits change? Will your supervisor change? This is all about change and change management, folks. And so, it is tough. And do you want to say anything before we wrap up?
Yeah, no, I just really want to sort of thank the sort of consultants that hung with us all the way to the end. We're really here to support you. I think, one of the things we've thought a lot about is you all may find yourself in situations where you're like, I don't know, maybe it's time. Maybe we need to upgrade our kind of ask in terms of what I'm doing with a particular client. And, as a fellow colleague, we're here to help. So let us know. Let us know how we can be helpful, if you kind of find yourself in a set of circumstances that you're sort of like, I think this needs to go to the next level, or I think they're ready to engage a partner. Happy to kind of be helpful to you or be helpful to your clients to really kind of see where they are in this journey. If we can provide assistance, we're happy to.
And I'll just dive in real quick and sort of reiterate, I think Anne mentioned this, that the Hartford Foundation does have funding to provide for these conversations to happen if folks come to us through our technical assistance grant. So if you're working with Hartford area organizations that want to have these conversations, we do have funds to help with that consulting piece. So I just wanted to mention that. I also just really wanted to thank Anne and Jim. I know they're in a very, very busy period. I think that they did a terrific job providing this high level overview. We want to thank all of you for hanging in, and also, having said that this is an overview, please tell us in the survey or contact us and let us know what else would be helpful. If we did a follow-up or follow-ups to this session, what else would you want? So please do that in the survey. And thanks so much, everybody, for joining us today.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Take care.
Thanks, Anne.